Thank you so much, Evan, and the IRC for collaborating on this event. Thank you as well to Melissa and her team at the World Trade Center, Kansas City, who I think unfortunately cannot be with us today, but the World Trade Center, Kansas City offers a variety of programs and resources to stimulate international trade. I'm sure some in the audience are familiar with their excellent work. Um, it was kind of nice to get a shout out from the national organizers. This is the fifth year, I believe, that we've been doing this joint format with the IRC and Kansas City, and it's been a delight every year. My name is Jack Zhang. I'm the associate director for the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Kansas and the director of the KU Trade War Lab. The Center for East Asian Studies at KU is a major academic hub and premier outreach network in the Great Plains region, disseminating knowledge about East Asian languages and cultures and building global competencies for the 21st century. We have 20, we have 60 plus affiliated faculty members across 25 departments. And we're proud to be, I guess, a longtime sponsor of the Chinatown Hall event and format. It's been a difficult year for our center and I think for area study centers across the US that depend on Title VI support. But we're glad to be able to deliver events like this today and hope to continue to do so in the future. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to moderate this local Chinatown Hall and to welcome our speaker, Professor Ning Leng from the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, and the author of an excellent new book, Politicizing Business: How Firms Are Made to Serve the Party and the State. Welcome, Ning, for joining us for this event. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. Thank you for being with us here tonight and joining us for the national broadcast and for this conversation. This event is being recorded, and we encourage audience members to go ahead and use the Q&A feature, ask your question anytime. I'm going to kick off the discussion with a few broad questions, and then I will transition over and try to weave in audience questions or ask them directly of our speaker until we are at the bottom of our hour. So without further ado, let's get started. Again, Ning, so great to have you here. Been an admirer of your work for a really long time, and I want to open by asking you to maybe help dispel what I see as two common but sort of contradictory misconceptions that Americans have when we talk about business and politics and how they interact in China, which is on the one end of the spectrum, right? I see your book as dispelling this idea that, folks go to China maybe for the first time. You go to Shanghai, you see there's McDonald's and Starbucks, and you conclude, well, China's not communist anymore. It seems like it is, private enterprise is thriving here, and so, it's just like another normal country, right? In that regard. And then the other sort of view on another conventional wisdom on the very opposite of that, which is, I think, more and more prevalent in recent years, right? Which is like, of course, it's still a communist country. The party controls everything, including the private sector, and so anything that involves a Chinese company, right, even though it claims to be private, like Alibaba or Shein, there's the hand of the state behind it. And so where do you come down on these two sort of contrasting conventional wisdoms?
Thank you so much, Jack, for the wonderful questions and for having me. It's great to be here. So I love this question. It's a great way to frame this tension of our understanding of Chinese political economy, and that's exactly where my book sits. So the communist in name only, right, is exactly as you were saying, that look at China's economic growth, look at the thriving private sector. Clearly, the party, right, is staying out of the way when it comes to business. And then the party controls everything is that opposite. And then it goes, every major business decision is ultimately political and no company is truly private in China. And I would say both views are partially right, but importantly, wrong. So the party does not micromanage business in China, at least not every business or not every business decision. That would be impossible. That would be counterproductive to the party. But the party does reserve the right to intervene at any moment in any sector for political reasons that have very little to do with economic logic. And companies in China know this. The knowledge alone that the party could interfere at any time, right, anywhere, is shaping business behavior, even when the party might not be actively intervening. So, what a more accurate picture might look like is somewhere in between, right? Not necessarily a comfortable middle ground. But China, I think, the political economy is a system where the companies are given some autonomy. I call that a partial credible commitment from the state. Companies are given some autonomy to be productive, but they never had full autonomy as companies in a different system. The party's hand is sometimes and oftentimes invisible until it is not. And when the party's hand shows up, it can demand almost anything from business. And what my book adds to the argument, right? Then the next question will be, when will the party intervene? So my book adds to the argument that outside of economic predation or national security or strategic competition, there's also a political logic there. And in my book, particularly, I talk about two political logic that is going to make the party intervene in business. One of them is China's regime stability, and the other is Chinese officials' career incentives, very much shaped by how Communist Party control China. So to sum up, China is neither pure capitalist nor is it, purely party-controlled political economy. It is a system where politics and business are permanently entangled and on parties' terms. It's how I view the system.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's an excellent sort of way to frame this conversation. I try to drop some links to the center and to your book in the chat. I'm not sure if that is only panelists can see it, and so maybe I'll try to post it to the Q&A and see if there's any way uh, our audience members can take a look at that link. But I want to follow up on that and ask you to summarize, right? What is in a nutshell, then what is the sort of takeaway when under like how often has encroachment to the private sector in China happened, and what is your prediction at the sector level, which I think is very rich. Yeah, how do you address this in your book?
Absolutely. My book basically discovered that after 1993, Chinese states intervention, political intervention in business follows a sectoral pattern, exactly as you were mentioning. And I described that. So there are many political services that the party state would demand of business. There are some of them that we're familiar with. For example, when economy is not doing well, the party state wants business to create jobs beyond what the business could, right? And clearly, the party state asks certain sectors to monitor and surveil the society, certain sectors to watch and censor the society or internet, right? So some of these are obvious. And I, in the book, describe two more political services. One of them is what I call visibility projects. And in Chinese language, I will actually translate it into 政绩工程. And this is something that Xi Jinping has continued to warn against ever since end of 2025. Actually, very last week, he said we got to stop visibility projects. And visibility projects is basically these large, over the top, large scale, they could be infrastructure projects, they could be a program. It is a government effort to reach a certain vague goal given by Beijing. And what happens? So I'll give an example of visibility projects. This will be a very typical example. This will happen in Qingdao City in northern China. This is a city that hugs a bay. And there are 2 points of the city sitting at the opposite sides of the bay, and there was a problem to connect them. So to reduce traffic time, Qingdao government made this absolutely valid urban planning, idea. They say, let's connect the 2 bays with a road. Now the question is, do you connect them with an oversea bridge or do you connect them with an undersea tunnel? And all of the engineering experts came out and say it has to be a tunnel because this is a northern city, tons of weather hazard. If you build a bridge, and this will be the longest bay bridge built back then, if you build a bridge, then for months in a year, nobody could use the bridge because, right, it will be icy, there will be wind, it will be shaking. Tunnel is going to be easier for everybody, and you can use it for longer days every year, and frankly, maintenance cost is going to be lower. But the mayor of Qingdao back then decided that, well, but nobody could see a tunnel. We would have made a tunnel, but no one would know. This is such a great thing I did for the Qingdao city. So he insisted on building that Bay Bridge. And as he was building the bridge, he quickly realized everybody else was correct. So he's like, all right, let's also build that undersea tunnel. And that is duplicate engineering project. It was a huge waste. It was 2 billion US dollars put into a bridge that didn't need to exist. And so that would be an example of visibility projects. And so the company's role when government wants to build visibility projects is this. Government knows that visibility projects are wasteful. So they don't want to be blamed for wasteful spending. So they will go to business. And this could be state-owned business, they could be private business. They will say, why don't you pay for visibility projects? Now, understanding their dependence on the local government, business a lot of the times will agree to build visibility projects, which are projects that, number one, the business cannot control the cost, and two, business might not be able to get any returns. And so when visibility projects are demanded of business, a lot of the times, private companies, not the state-owned ones, private companies with hard budget constraint are going to gradually retreat from the sector. So this is the first political service. And the second political service that I described that was less noticed before this book was how companies directly engage in controlling social protest, maintaining social stability beyond monitoring surveillance. And actually companies would directly, contribute money and human, manpower on the street. So this kind of political services happen a lot in sectors where there was a lot of public protest. So for example, building a large PX chemical factory, for example, have a nuclear plant, for example, have a mine. And nowadays in real estate, in financial sector, right? These are sectors where we see a lot of public protest. The interesting thing here is the Chinese officials or the government will have an incentive to distance themselves from the protest. This is a legitimacy issue about Communist Party's control of China, right? They would like the public to think that it's the companies that you should blame, right? The public usually in this kind of sectors will blame both the government and the business. Business are the evil business. And government, out of selective enforcement reasons, corruption, or just not, functioning. The public will say government bears responsibility as well. So it's important for government to distance themselves from the protest and the cause of it. They will go to the companies and they will ask the companies to do two things for them. One, if the protest can be resolved with money, you could buy off the protesters. You could say, we're going to promise you, we're going to fine this company a lot of money, we'll give you the money, and we'll order the company to, shape up, right? They will ask the company to be a scapegoat in this situation. The second way to deal with protests is when the protest is so large or when the project is so sensitive that you can no longer buy off the protesters, you have to use violence. You have to put police and semi-military force on the ground. Then you would need a powerful company to stand with you and just say, this project is for public benefit. And so depends on what the local government needs dealing with public protests. They prefer either a private firm or a state-owned enterprise. The private firm would be the perfect ones to be a scapegoat, where they will say, I'm going to spit out money, I'm going to accept your punishment, let's appease the protest together. In exchange, local government, relax on your regulations. Don't actually enforce your punishment, on us. And when the government needs, use the violence to suppress protests, they will need a SOE, a state-owned enterprise, preferably from central government, because central SOEs basically could never make a mistake, quote unquote, right? Their projects are for the benefit of the entire China and they are tied to central government. So they will partner with a central SOE and say, let's use violence. And this will be now justified. It will be agreed, allowed by Beijing. So when the political service here is protest, and depending on what the local government needs to use, carrot or stick, we will see a sector start to change. Some sector will become more private capital focused, and the other sectors will be more state capital focused. So these are the two very specific services I described. And basically, I would say the big takeaway from the book is number one, in China, political service is everywhere. These are subtle political services that are very hard to observe. And they could happen in any sector as mundane as, a bus sector or a waste treatment sector. And the second thing is whenever Chinese government interferes in the economy, they will over interfere. There's no very difficult for them to find the right degree to interfere in the economy. So that's a bit long of a summary, but
No,
yeah.
that's fantastic. And so if I could summarize, so these, as the costs of these political, or I guess economic services that are, against sort of the profit, shareholder value for the firms increase, they're more likely to just back out of certain sectors, right? That's the
Mhm,
argument.
mhm.
And we've seen this sort of increase in recent years. Do you have a sense of what? I know you profile, several sectors in your book. Like, what is the scale of, the change over time and also like what, there are still like restaurant industry, right, is relatively dominated by private sector sort of still. So is there a sense of scale and change over time that you can sort of share with us, or how do we contextualize how bad things have gotten in recent years? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think in recent years, I would say actually, I see the trend of Chinese state expanding their politicization into more sectors. The first logic is social stability. So because economy is going down, the government and the Chinese government doesn't do enough redistribution, but they want business to give money, to give money to the public in several ways. So example in restaurant, right? They want restaurants to be cheaper. They want grocery stores to be cheaper. They
Mm,
want rents to be cheaper. And so they would go to owners of this kind of, cheaper buildings, or this is actually, I learned this on the ground, or grocery stores, and they would say price gotta be under control. You cannot, go make a lot of profit for yourself. That is against social stability. They would also now go to private companies. In the past, they only go to state-owned enterprise for this, but now they will go to private companies and say, do not fire anyone. We know you can't afford this people's salary, but do not fire anyone. This is for social stability,
mm,
incentive. So this is one thing that is expanding in more sectors about what the government asked business to do. The government itself is not really increasing on insurance. They're not increasing on unemployment insurance or subsidies to companies to hire more people, not that, but they want companies to shoulder the cost. So this is one change.
mm.
The other interesting thing is about visibility projects. Now, this is a very different political logic. This logic is local government officials are always frustrated about how can we get promoted. There is no clear way to understand how to get promoted. So visibility projects is driven by individual career incentive. And visibility projects happen whenever Beijing has a new goal. And this goal will be vague because it's new, meaning Beijing doesn't know how to get there. So when Beijing has another goal, for example, right now, innovation, we will talk about robotics, we're talking about AI, we're talking about cyber, all of these industries. Beijing doesn't know yet how to develop them. Local governments will flood into these sectors and create visibility projects, which will be a huge waste on any new frontier that CCP's development, plan is getting into. So right now, in visibility projects, I'm seeing a change of sectors. In the past, it will be focusing on environmental related sectors because that was the focus. Food security, that was a focus. Today, it's technology. So more visibility projects will show up in technology sectors.
That's so interesting. I remember a presentation of yours where it's like they built a field of solar panels in the shape of a panda, or like things like that. I'm excited to see
Yeah.
what kind of fun visibility projects this current sort of focus will create. I'm gonna weave in a question from the audience, which is I think very much related to this topic, which is, are there any good examples of where party career sort of needs can have a positive influence on companies, or I don't know, on sort of what companies do, and then they speculate that maybe the Wanda Plaza is like a positive sort of example. Yeah, are there, does this always sort of lead to folly, or are there cases, maybe actually the environment one is a good point of departure, right? Where progress has been
Yeah.
made because of these incentives.
Absolutely. So the Wanda Plaza is absolutely a good example, similar to the Global Development Center. For those of you who know Chengdu City, the largest one-body architecture for shopping and conference, right? These are older generation of visibility projects. In this kind of scenario, in fact, both of these are kind of funded by private entrepreneurs. So the local government leader, party secretary, would go to the private enterprise and say, I want a center to be built. I know it's going to be too big. It might not be able to make money, but I want it built. In the Chengdu case, the Global Development Center, that I actually know this case pretty well, entrepreneur rejected at first. He said, well, but we are not going to make money. It's just Chengdu. It's a great city, but it's not Beijing or Guangzhou. And the party secretary said, yeah, but I'm not going to reduce the size of the center, but I'm going to make it up to you. I'm going to give you land deals elsewhere at a cheaper price. So you get to make money elsewhere, but I want a signature building. So this is one of those examples of how government officials change company operation. A very new example that I got is about all of these, the current hype of building smart factories. Ideally, that would mean you have, robotic in your factories to do, assembly line work. But in this one very specific case, there was really no need for smart factory at all. This is a very different sector. You need people there to get the job done. But the local official said to this factory owner, you have to give me a smart factory that I can tell the center we're trying. So what did they do? They installed tons of cameras around the factory floor plan. Does nothing really to the production, but that makes it a smart factory. So these are very specific examples of how government official came in and say, change your operation for us.
Excellent. Thank you. Could I follow up and ask a question about sort of sectors where China, like these stories make it seem like it would be very, very hard for companies to operate and be, both profitable and innovative. And yet, we see strides being made in, especially the startup, sector. I guess EVs came up in the national broadcast, right? In leading edge sort of AI. How do some of these sectors manage to sort of get around, right, or stay out of the radar of local officials, or don't they? What is your take on this?
For so in terms of visibility projects, a lot of the sectors at first would not be noticed by the local government official
Mhm.
until the center decided this is a new development, orientation. When the center decided it's a new development direction, local government officials will move in. Like in the EV industry, I bet there were lots of visibility projects, like a factory that might not be fully utilized or, overcapacity, frankly, could be explained partially by that the
Mhm.
sector has become a visibility project. In that case, this actually explains the low profit margin of EV manufacturers in China. It could have been much higher than what it is. But because of these, production demand by the local government, they're not making enough money. And eventually it gets a lot of the private companies gets crowded out and state capital has to come in because state capital has soft budget constraint. They could do whatever they want, right? Visibility projects can be unlimited, right? Practically by state-owned enterprise. And that actually explains why in these sectors, state capital comes in, private capital leaves. So I think it's not a contradiction here. It's just it explains some of the trajectory of these sectors.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to invite the audience members to submit additional questions. I see the earlier question about flights that I will weave in to the discussion later. Actually, I want to ask you about a little bit about the motivation for writing this book and the journey that that you did a tremendous amount of field work for this. I'd love to hear you sort of share that and maybe some lessons or sort of challenges for our students who might be in the audience and interested in doing field work in China. And I know that your next project is kind of on Chinese firms overseas. So if you want to give us a sneak peek of what your thoughts are on that second project, I'd love to hear that as well, please.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the fieldwork part was actually fun. I spent, 4 years, 2015 to 2019, and the longest leg that I stayed in China at once was 18 months. It was great. I had to say doing fieldwork even back then, 2015, 2016, was already difficult. I was a PhD from a US university, right? That comes, there's both pros and cons with that identity. So I had to get affiliated with two universities in China, one in the north, one in the south. And then once I have Chinese university to say, this person is good, this is actual academic research, people start to be more willing to meet with me. Once they started to meet with me, I realized actually these government officials and business people, they love to talk. They really wanted to, some sense, tell their stories because their life are difficult. Both the government officials and business people consider their lives very difficult. And I thought that was quite interesting. That was unexpected. So I met with the same people multiple times. I started to shadow them. And so the fieldwork eventually became pretty, I would say pretty deep. I managed to do that. Today, I would say still get affiliated with a Chinese university if possible. This is advice for future PhD students and have patience in the field. However, I would say in general, today I would think fieldwork is quite difficult to do. And it probably has little to do with what your research topic is or what your findings might be. It's simply that China is changing and people are getting more nervous about who they're talking to and what they're saying. So we have to be creative beyond fieldwork as well. So that's an unfortunate thing, but I hope that this trend would change eventually in China. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Fingers crossed on there. If you could talk a little bit about your new project, I'm personally very curious about this, the link between, all these difficult sort of struggles that private companies are facing in China, and then, the incentives and environments they're finding themselves outside of China.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, this actually had to do also with your research on firm exit, right? Even though you were studying US firms exiting China, I realized that Chinese firms are trying to exit China as well. There is an exodus, particularly from private Chinese companies.
Mhm.
For a lot of them, actually, ideally, the market environment when they leave China would be somewhere with high level of rule of law and hopefully, high consumption. So developed country would be that choice. But we know, the US-China relationship today, which is the theme of today's discussion, right? Even Europe-China relations is making this a little bit difficult today. So a lot more private entrepreneurs have to go to other regions in the world. And I follow them to Latin America, which is the ultimate new frontier for many of these business. The interesting thing about Latin America, and this is why I choose this area, is this is a land of mostly developing economies. In South America, actually, all of them will be categorized as developing economies. And Chinese companies going to developing economies usually concentrate in specific sectors. So we're talking about, for example, construction, mining, right? And then infrastructure, including telecommunication. The interesting thing about these companies is that before, when they went overseas, mostly was Southeast Asia and Africa. And these two regions don't have many democracies. Latin America will be that first region for these companies in these sectors to go to a developing economy, but democracies. So that institutional, this will be a new institutional challenge for them. They have to relearn what the market environment is. They have to understand rule of law there is very different from rule by law, for example, than in domestic China. It's a totally new learning experience. So my second project is trying to understand when they go to South America, what are they learning? What are they good at? And what are they, less adapted to? And this is one thing I realized. I have some really interesting preliminary findings, and I realized that for a lot of Chinese companies, it is difficult because basically going to a democratic developing economy requires all of these companies to change their cost structure. Their cost benefit that they enjoyed in China no longer gives them advantages. We're talking about lower labor and environmental cost. But what is dragging them down in China, which is the high political cost of doing business, in a democracy, that cost gets reduced. So all of these companies had to relearn about how do we behave, how do we operate as a business? How do we deal with the government in these countries? And it's really interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. And that it reminds me of this, the logic of the export driven sort of model where the discipline of the market, right, helped solve kind of the selection problem of which companies governments subsidize. This is almost the inverse of that, which is like you need to be competitive when you operate overseas. And I wonder how much of those practices and efficiencies might be transferred back.
Mhm.
But on that related topic, I do want to ask a follow-up on this new project and link it back to your first book, which is, well, I think front of mind for policymakers in here in the US and I think in Latin American countries is how politicized is business, Chinese business, private companies when they come into, those markets, right? Um, are companies free, or their subsidiaries at least operating in Latin America, free from providing political services to the CCP, or are they still, because they have operations in China, somehow, right, expected or incentivized to, act in the state's interest in these new markets?
Absolutely. I think here there are two questions. One is ownership that most people are talking about. So state-owned enterprise, they will always have very close relationship with the party, right? That's just no question about that. The second question is, okay, but what about private companies? Do all
Mhm.
of them work for the party state when they go overseas? I think this is actually not an issue about whether all of them work for the state. I think the question is, what kind of sectors are we talking about? Some sectors, they are not strategically important to CCP. They are not going to deliver enough, important information to the CCP. And the CCP very much, my observation, would just let these companies go when they go abroad. Most of these sectors will be consumer facing. So if, for example, we're talking about rideshare app when they go abroad, right? CCP We never know. I don't have all of the data, but from all of the open source data I find, right, CCP is not necessarily that interested in these companies. But if a company, is in a strategic sector that is absolutely essential to CCP's long-term plan, for example, if you're in mining and you're mining critical minerals, and there's some really big private companies from China in, mining. So CCP, I bet, would love to support these companies. For example, if you're trying to get lithium back to China, that would be a great deal, right? For CCP, that's the business interest and state interest is consistent, right? Now, whether that is a strategic concern for the host country government or for other governments, that's a different question. But I can see that state business have mutual interest. And if it is a business that has to do with strategic interest to the CCP, I would imagine they would support a private company as well. And when it comes to their relationship with companies, with Chinese companies abroad, right? There are carrots and sticks to be used. My observation is that CCP prefers to use carrots first to work with these companies when they go abroad. It's only when carrots stop working that they will try to use stick. Because these companies are now the subsidiaries, right? They are already overseas. They're now subject to a different country's law. It's actually more difficult for the CCP to use sticks to motivate them. So carrots become more useful when companies go overseas.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very insightful. I'm wondering, mirroring sort of the environment of sort of securitization makes it so challenging, right? Because it makes more and more sectors subject to these kinds of considerations. As you hinted at earlier, more and more sectors are now seen as, right, important and critical on the Chinese side. And I kind of observe a similar pattern happening in the US side, right, where, rather unprecedentedly, right, we have similar dynamics is what you're describing, right? These either economic or political services being provided by companies like Intel, or where golden shares, right, are given over to sort of the government in exchange for investing in maybe swing states, right? What are some of the lessons, I guess, in that? And I mean, first of all, do you agree with that observation that these same dynamics, I guess, could play out in a very different, we hope, still political system right here in the US, where the government doesn't have the same incentives, certainly not at the local level, and maybe the federal government lacks the experience of wielding carrots and sticks. But are there some parallels? Are there some convergences in state business relations, sort of evolving in recent years?
Hmm. I agree with that observation. And I think actually politicizing business is a universal phenomenon. It definitely goes beyond China or the United States. It's universal. The difference is in the degree of it and in the methods of it. So in the United States, I would say I cannot imagine US would never get to how the degree of how CCP controls business in China. I don't think it could ever get there because there is rule of law. The legal system is independent. It is serious, right? So companies will get protected by law. This is different than in China. In China, if you look at this new law that came up, end of last year, the first law ever, actually, that is aiming at promoting private business. The law, I think, translating will be the law of promotion of private economy in China. If you look at this law, clause 2 would say private economy's development in China has to stick to the correct political direction and has to be under, guidance of the Chinese Communist Party. You would not see that kind of law in the United States. And so there is a difference in degree. And that I think is one of the most important difference. And then the second difference is what is the reason for politicization of business, right? Beyond China. Mostly it comes down to in a country with, weaker rule of law, there could be economic predation. We see this in weaker democracies in terms of, oil, electricity, and that happens. And the second most important reason for politicization of business beyond China in democracies would be national interest. If this has to do with, right, you can't let foreign power control key sectors, right? Those would be basically the two dominant reasons. But in China, there will be more reasons about one, social stability. Right? How does US handle unemployment? If unemployment becomes an issue, it has to come from unemployment insurance. The government, it would be very difficult, impossible for
Mhm.
the government to say, you cannot fire people company, or you have to hire more than you need, right? If they
Mhm.
don't own the company. China can do that. So social stability is one extra reason that for politicizing business in China. And then government individual officials' career would be tied to or could be tied to business contribution. In the US, business contribute to politicians by campaign finance. In China, not just that, right? Business would also contribute to local projects. That's gonna only benefit the government official, but not the business. So that's also very different. More reasons for Chinese government to politicize business, more likely for them to be successful, and much wider range and deeper degree in their intervention.
Well said. Yeah, I can see a very exciting sort of new wave of comparative literature looking at this question. One more on this before I turn to the audience question on flights. And again, welcome audience members to submit additional questions. We'd love to keep this interactive for you. Is foreign invested enterprises is an interest of mine, as you know, right? And in the past, right, there were decades of relatively sort of thriving, and happy environments in China for multinationals. In recent years, there's been a diminution of that enthusiasm, and of course, it's gotten harder since the trade war. How much of that is because of this greater, degree of politicization? Are foreign multinationals in China playing the same kind of games as they localize? Is this driving sort of some of the exit that Sam and I have worked on to sort of observe, please?
Yeah, foreign companies will be subject to the same game of politicization in China. They cannot actually escape that. So one example of Google's exit of China back in 2010, if you look at the Google official announcement, actually became very clear. They were called to provide political services like all of the other internet companies, censorship, monitoring, surveillance. And Google, it's not that Google rejected to do it, it's that after Google did it, it realized did not help them at all. Because this political services demanded of all internet companies, they were still behind Baidu in market share. Then suddenly they have this extra cost that's causing reputational loss beyond Chinese market. And they're not even getting that big a market share. So they exited. So my observation is foreign companies, they were called to provide political services in the same way in China. It's just that they are less likely or less capable to provide political services. And so they have a natural disadvantage. And I think for a while they thrive in China because this will depend on the sector. A lot of the sectors that they thrived had less political use to the Chinese government back then, but now maybe the political value of these sectors are increasing. And then there's also unavoidably, right, the geopolitical tension between China and the United States. And this will cause a particularly difficult time for United States American companies in China. So there are a lot of reasons for why they eventually exited. Yeah, so I guess that's all I can offer about this question.
Thank you. We have an audience question. It is actually many questions, so let me do my best. You can take a look and we'll answer it live. There's several components. One is, is there a moment that you think these less worthy, I guess, visibility projects, right, really induce harm on the local governments? And there's some discussion of that. And then I think there's a second topic that the questioner wants to ask, which is more on the less on the firms kind of exiting China and more on, I guess, individuals emigrating away. This new trend of Ren theology, right? Ren or Ren Xin, like people emigrating, to various sort of destinations. If you have any views on that. And then lastly, a third topic, which is it feasible for Trump to make manufacturing come back to the US? And I guess there's a nice link there into this, something that came up in the national broadcast, which is an openness and maybe what we'll see some agreement for Chinese investment maybe to come to the US, and then all of these dynamics that you're talking about in your book will be at play as we navigate which projects should be welcome, where, and so forth. So three sort of topics. I'll let you take those in the order that you prefer.
Sure. Um, so let me think about the first question, whether it will induce harm on the government. I think it does induce harm on government, the public, to be honest, and business, all three parties. So the high-speed train example is actually great. A lot of the high-speed rail lines make sense. They perfect for them to be there. They should be there, right? Between the largest hubs of China, they really reduce traffic costs, they reduce time, fantastic ideas. But then a lot of the lines, actually majority, last year China actually have this new data coming out. I forgot the number. Majority of them are actually losing money because not enough people are using high-speed railway or need to use high-speed railway. The question then becomes, what is the opportunity cost of building all of these high-speed railway that is going to deliver a visibility projects for local government officials, right? We're talking about tens of $billions. What else could we have used this money for? How about redistribution, welfare, right? To benefit to the people or projects that business could actually make money from. So the issue with visibility project, I think, is opportunity cost on everybody involved, government, business, and society. That is its, one of the biggest problem. Second problem is it distorts development. I actually think it creates too much waste in trying to find the actual development trajectory. Money are put on visible components rather than invisible components. But we all know for sustainable development, invisibility sometimes is even more important than visibility. And so that's the second issue with visibility projects. Um, and then the exodus, the new trend. So this is not something I researched, but this is just my observation as somebody who studies China. I find it interesting that Chinese now are trying to run to a bigger variety of countries, including Chinese that are, now actually try to permanently emigrate to South America. I actually met plenty of Chinese there, and I thought this is interesting. In the past, people who left China, right, the fact that these people could go to US, Canada, and Europe is because a lot of them are upper middle class and beyond, right? They're looking for, and they're highly educated. They're looking for a better opportunity abroad. But today, when we see a much bigger range of, how should I say this, socioeconomic class in China are trying to leave China, I think that shows how bad the economy has become. That lower middle class and, particularly the working class who used to have a easy to find jobs in construction and manufacturing, those jobs clearly are gone. And so that's why more of them are escaping China. I think this should really just shows how bad the economy has become. Um, Oh, so the Trump question about manufacturing back to America. I mean, Sharpie is back to the US. I was reading this article and I find it interesting. The most successful manufacturing, like coming back to the US, was Sharpie. And the fact that they managed to make profit here in the US is because they use a lot of robotics. So they didn't create more jobs. That's interesting. But they're back in the US and they're making money. So hard to know. This question is really not my expertise. And I don't know whether we need a lot of manufacturing to be back in the US or what kind. But yeah.
Yeah, if I can jump in on this and editorialize a little bit, I think the work on reshoring is sort of emerging. I know Professor Katzung's working on this a little bit, but there's a limited sort of it's not very large to begin with. The FDI story I think is very big. Here in Kansas, we have, Panasonic has a four billion dollar plant down the road from KU. I think you'll see actually more companies like that readjust supply chains to make it work. But I think you're absolutely right that, it's not about, I think there's a desirability, there's a mystique around manufacturing in the same way that I think people lionize farmers in like developing, and when we have developed markets, there's like this nostalgia about legacy sort of industries, and that comes with some, distortions about the past of like how like in the pandemic, I tried to do some light gardening in the back, made me gain tremendous respect for farmers and how like, backbreaking and difficult kind of the work is and how, to be efficient, farmers are like amazingly sort of advanced already. I think we actually have that same dynamic in manufacturing, which is the US, there's this story about manufacturing decline mostly measured in terms of employment, and that is true. Right? But that undersells the fact that the US still, has the portion of manufacturing and the output is just as strong as ever. And the reason is because our supply chains are, the companies that have managed to adapt to the world where there's global value chains still manufacture and export in the US, like Ford, like Boeing, like, furniture manufacturers in North Carolina, like, you know, um, your car makers in the Midwest. And so it's just different than before, and the future will also be different still. And so, this whole conversation, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like will it bring jobs, and will the jobs be jobs that people want? That's the really big question, right? Can you get factories running here? Somehow I think that's probably possible. I want to turn to an earlier the first question in the Q&A, which is about flights. Maybe looping back and asking you about the experience of maybe your students at Georgetown in recent years, right? And what their experience has been like. There's a lot of challenges flying directly to China because of the closing of the airspace and reduction number of flights. There seems to be some challenges of getting visas, coming to the US, right? More lengthy administrative checks, even for people who, have been coming routinely here in the US. I actually have a PhD student who halfway through his PhD, the visa was mysteriously sort of denied, not appealed, and so he had to
Oof.
restart actually at a Hong Kong sort of university. So, you know, it's happening for sure. So what's your sense of, I guess, this current situation with, connectivity and visas and people-to-people exchange? What are your expectations for changes in the future on these? I know this is not what you work on, but it's something that we both follow, I guess. Yeah.
I know, definitely. And it matters to, both of our students. It's such a big question. And Georgetown, yeah, we were dealing with the same situation, right? New semester began. A lot of students couldn't come back to the US on time because of all of these extra visa checks. I think I think within academia, Jack, and I think you would agree with my observation, is academics would like more exchange, right? Academic exchange among faculty and among students between China and the US. And I think this is what Chinese academics themselves will want as well. What I observe right now is this, let's say China and the US have this inconsistent preference in what kind of academic exchange to have. China would love to encourage more STEM, exchange, but US actually would love more social science and humanities exchange. So I think that the demand and the focus here obviously is politically driven, but I think because of there is this mismatch, it makes this process a little bit more difficult from both sides. So I have no idea. I guess we can just hope for the best because academic exchange is very important. And this show up in the national part of this tonight's discussion, right? It's important for American students to go to China and see what China really is. And likewise, it's important for Chinese students to understand, get education here if they choose to. So we can only hope for the best.
Absolutely. I think a silver lining, hopefully, of all, the summit next month, if it happens, is maybe it'll check some of these really counterproductive local level tendencies that I want to speak on a little bit, right? Of it hasn't arrived in Kansas and Missouri yet. I worry that it will, but policies in Texas and Florida that are, you know, banning basically admissions of, on the basis of nationality, right? It used to be about like certain sensitive programs and things like that. Now it's like sweeping sort of, we're just not going to admit, Chinese students, from the university in general. And then there's also policies about not being able to get visas after if you graduate from an American university, that these places are not issuing or sponsoring sort of visas. Maybe that's broader than just China. I think the policies are rapidly sort of evolving, but it's alarming to see sort of that take place in more and
Mm,
more states. And
mm.
that more than flights, I think, will be the challenging thing for at least the sort of education exchanges that you and I care about, right? Is that these policies will make it, increasingly unattractive for people to come here, and then for talent that are coming out of, American universities to be able to stay and sort of contribute here as well. So, um,
Absolutely. And it's not just, an issue of most important thing is attracting talent for the US, right? Standing, on from the US government side. Also, higher education in the US is that one of the most important soft power tools I think the United States has. And so, yeah, there's a lot of value to it for the US government, frankly, to encourage academic exchange.
Amen. So I see no further audience questions. I will ask sneak in one about expectations for the future. I know from some of your comments, you don't seem to be very optimistic about like the current state of kind of economic doldrums within China, the slowing growth. And some of your comments suggested that there will be a ratcheting, sort of an expansion and ratcheting up of greater demands that the government is putting on private businesses. Are there any conditions that you see for like a ratcheting down or a loosening or liberalizing sort of tendencies that are counterbalancing this? Yeah, what do you anticipate?
I don't I don't see signs of liberalizing trend at this point. I hope I'm missing those signs. I personally don't see them. I think what the government could do, though, the Chinese government in terms of, helping its own economy, is instead of all of the so-called state development model, which I actually disagree. I don't think China is a state capitalism kind of model. I think instead of putting a lot of money into manufacturing subsidiary, to be honest, half blindly doing so,
Mm,
Chinese government could redistribute more. I think a lot of the government spending should move from infrastructure and subsidies to manufacturing technology into healthcare, education, retirement, unemployment insurance. I think it's frankly time to build a
mm,
social safety network because if this succeeds, then Chinese citizens will be willing to spend. And consumption right now, as a percentage of GDP in China, is really low. It's lower than
mhm,
many fellow developing countries. And Chinese government has been trying to make Chinese people spend more. And the method shouldn't be drop the interest rate to zero. It didn't work. It has been going on, right? Low interest rate forever. It did
mhm.
not work. It needs to make the people feel safer. So if Chinese government like could do that, I think the economy would bounce back to a certain degree. To what degree, I cannot predict. But I think that would be where, some hope would emerge.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, and I have a follow-up to that question. But I'd like to point out, like, there's maybe, a takeaway is you can kind of see the manufacturing side of things as a national visibility project, right? Because it's like visible that they're offering these subsidies to buy very concrete things, right? They're like, buy an EV, we will give you, incentives and tax breaks and rebates and things like that.
Mm.
But no, you should take care of your own, healthcare, right? Yeah, so it's like if there's a way to make, I mean, you would think I guess hospitals are visible, but the people who work in them and the quality is not less visible or whatever. But yeah, I definitely share your thoughts there. My follow-up was just that, in your book, I recall like you studied sort of waves of encroachment, right? And in the past, some of these waves were checked, right? They were going back to the 1990s, and it hasn't been like a steady drumbeat of like a return to a planned economy and state control. In fact, it's quite the opposite until maybe recent years. So that's what I was kind of getting at is that like, are there any lessons learned from when, the government changed course and stopped sort of that encroachment in the past?
The government was finding themselves in a difficult spot after they encroach in a certain sector because many of these sectors that they earlier encroached on, very soon the government regretted it. After they got what they want from the sector, be it visibility projects or social stability, they realized that actually they are not business people. They cannot get these sectors
Mm,
going. So they would in fact regret and go back to the private entrepreneurs and say, could you please come back? Like this happened in so many sectors, in agriculture, in
mm,
manufacturing, in services. But because, that's the somewhat credible commitment, the credible commitment was broken when the Chinese stay encroaching them so deeply. It's hard to get private capital back in. So after they encroach, state capital will have to stay in these sectors for a long time. And state capital, we all know, it's not efficient. So basically, these sectors became suboptimal compared to what they were before. So,
mm,
but the interesting thing is, can the Chinese government learn? So this is actually a much bigger question than what my book will answer. But this is something that we all wonder, right? Is Chinese government good at learning? Or is it that it has, weathered all of these, to be honest, only two large economic crises, right, in the past 30 years, 1997 and then 2008. COVID is the very recent one. The Chinese government learned how to handle economic crises. Have they really upgraded their, let's say, prescription for the economy? The fact is, I personally do not see that. How they dealt with post-COVID is the same of how they dealt with post-2008, is the same how they dealt with post-1997, which is tons of government money into infrastructure. At this point, when infrastructure is so saturated, this kind of injection of funds would not work. So the question is, why don't they inject a fund somewhere else? And so this is why I think part of my pessimism by observing the Chinese government's trend in their in their role in the economy, I did get pessimistic after writing this book.
I see. Well, I wish we had better news to end the conversation on, but it's been delightful and enlightening, and I hope our audience enjoyed this conversation. Um, uh, Thank you, Ning, for joining us. We will edit the video a little bit, put it on YouTube, and there will be a write-up in the Trade War Lab Substack as well. So hope audience members will follow the Center for East Asian Studies and join our newsletter and listserv, subscribe to the Substack, and hopefully join us again next year. Thank you, Evan and Melissa, for your partnership on this, and rock chalk. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.